Hey there, sleuths. Welcome to the Detective's Den, your one-stop spot for unpacking mysteries, cracking cases, and diving deep into the unknown. I'm your name, and I'll be your guide on this investigative journey. Globe showing Europe, Africa. Now tell me, from which corner of the globe are you tuning in today? Drop your location in the comments below. Let's see just how far our detective network reaches. Chapter 1, An Invitation to Peacock Manor. Hercule Poirot sat in his cozy flat at 33 Rue du Dragon, Paris, enveloped in the soft glow of a solitary lamp. The late afternoon sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving only the lamp's golden warmth to illuminate his impeccably arranged sitting room. Every aspect of the apartment was immaculate. The small silver tray held precisely 6 macarons arranged symmetrically. The reading chair was positioned at a perfect 30-degree angle to the small writing desk, and the little green carpet beneath his feet was free of even the faintest blemish. Poirot, fingers steepled and moustache waxed to perfection, was deep in reverie over his latest case notes when a knock sounded at the door. He rose with graceful precision. "Entrez, Illinois Vause Plat," he called, and the door opened to reveal his faithful friend, Captain Arthur Hastings, breezy and energetic as ever, his bowler hat slightly askew from the wind outside. "Mon ami," Hastings exclaimed, stepping inside. "I was just calling to see if you'd like to join me for dinner at Le Grand Café." He paused, noting Poirot's calm but expectant expression. "Or, if I may say, something rather mysterious is stirring your little grey cells." Poirot inclined his head with modest satisfaction. "Indeed, Hastings. A letter has arrived this very afternoon, more unusual, perhaps, than mere social engagement." He picked up the envelope laid upon the writing desk. "It is from England, bearing the crest of a peacock in gleaming gold. A most curious device." Hastings's eyes brightened. "A new adventure, then?" "Splendid." Poirot sliced open the envelope with the flat of his knife and extracted a finely written card edged in blue. He read aloud in his cultivated English accent. "Monsieur Poirot, your reputation for uncovering truths hidden from ordinary eyes is renowned. Peacock Manor, the ancestral home of the Askew family in the Devonshire countryside, lies shadowed by a most distressing event. I beg your presence at your earliest convenience to restore peace to my household. Lady Beatrice Askew." Hastings raised his eyebrows. "Devonshire, you say? A manor and shadows, sounds exactly like something out of a Gothic novel." "But, mon ami," Poirot replied, smoothing the card against his waistcoat, "we are not in the realm of fiction but reality. And reality, as you know, often presents subtleties that even the finest Gothic tale cannot encompass." He tapped his temple. "I feel those subtle vibrations already. A puzzle awaits, and how could I refuse?" Hastings clapped his hands together. "Brilliant. When do we leave?" "That depends." Poirot glanced at the clock. "The next train to London departs at 6:15 tomorrow evening. Lady Beatrice's letter requests me at your earliest convenience, which naturally means as soon as I can manage." "And I shall accompany you, of course?" Hastings asked, his tone hopeful. Poirot smiled gently. "Mais oui, Captain. Who better to serve as my chronicler and companion? You shall join me both on the journey and in the investigation." That evening, Poirot made the necessary arrangements. He penned a polite acceptance to Lady Beatrice, engaged a first-class carriage through Calais, and selected an ensemble suitable for the English countryside, tailored trousers of soft charcoal, a tweed jacket, and, of course, his signature bow tie. He carefully packed his brown leather case, arranging his meticulous notes, a fresh handkerchief embroidered with H.P., and 2 packets of chocolate eclairs for sustenance. At precisely 6 p.m. the following day, Poirot and Hastings alighted at Paddington Station. The air was crisp and tinged with the promise of autumn, though it remained July. They boarded the waiting carriage, and the train whisked them westward, past rolling green fields, grazing sheep, and quaint villages where children waved at the passing engine. Poirot watched from the window, expression calm yet alert, as if cataloguing every detail, the subtle architecture of station platforms, the fashion of farming attire, and the distinct scents carried on the breeze, hay, honeysuckle, and distant sea salt. They arrived at Exeter station in the early evening. A hansom cab was ready to convey them along a winding, lantern-lit road flanked by tall hedgerows. The moon, pale and slender, rode high in the sky, casting silvery beams through the trees. Occasionally, the cab wheels struck a stray pebble, producing a soft click that echoed in the stillness. At last, Peacock Manor came into view. It stood atop a gentle rise, its facade painted a soft cream, with grand windows framed by dark green shutters. At each corner of the front lawn, statues of peacocks held court, their stone feathers rendered with exquisite care. A low wall of ivy climbed the manor's walls, lending an air of timeless elegance marred only by the sense of seclusion. The cab drew up at the main entrance, and Poirot stepped down onto the gravel drive, tapping his fingers together in anticipation. Hastings followed, looking around with breathless delight. The heavy oak doors swung open before they could knock. A tall, dignified woman with silvered hair and a posture of unruffled grace stood in the threshold. Clad in a silk evening gown of muted lavender, she regarded them with composed, intelligent eyes. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, welcome to Peacock Manor," she said, her voice measured yet warm. "I am Beatrice Aestir. Please, come inside." Poirot bowed. "Madam, you extend your hospitality in the midst of trouble. I am honored to be of service." Hastings tipped his hat. "Delighted to meet you, Lady Aestir. Quite the impressive place you have here." Lady Beatrice offered to guide them through the grand entrance hall, where portraits of stern-faced ancestors peered down from the walls. Each painting depicted an Aestir in the prime of life, some adorned in 18th-century regalia, others in Victorian attire. Poirot admired the craftsmanship but noted, quietly to himself, that one frame bore scratch marks, as though someone had tried to force it open. "It was my husband's favorite portrait," Lady Beatrice explained, following Poirot's gaze. "Sir Lionel Aestir. He passed away 3 years ago. The portrait, thankfully, survived." She paused, her expression shadowed with memory. "But this summer, there have been other losses, smaller, perhaps, but no less distressing." They entered the drawing room, where tables were laid for tea, delicate bone china cups, a silver teapot, and a tiered stand of cakes and biscuits. Mrs. Harding, the housekeeper, stood at attention, her starched white apron immaculately pressed. Beside her was a low sideboard upon which stood a small, empty gilded frame, the very one Lady Beatrice had mentioned. Lady Beatrice led them to a settee by the window. She placed a trembling hand upon the empty frame. "Last week, my prized miniature portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds vanished. No note, no sign of forced entry, just gone. I fear someone within these walls may be responsible." Poirot's eyes gleamed. He leaned forward, fingertips lightly touching. "And this portrait, how large was it, and where did it hang?" "Not more than 6 inches high," Lady Beatrice replied. "It hung in my private gallery down the west corridor. Only select family and staff knew of its location." She sighed. "I hesitate to accuse anyone, but the catalogue value is immense, and the sentimental value, priceless." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "A crime of opportunity or of intention?" He straightened, tugging slightly at his jacket. "If you would be so kind, mademoiselle, to show us to this gallery." Mrs. Harding bowed. "Right this way, Monsieur Poirot." As they walked through the manor's hushed corridors, Poirot observed the patterned carpet, worn most heavily near each door. He noted a faint smudge on the polished banister, he even discerned the echo of their footsteps as lighter on certain flagstones. Each sensory detail registered in his mind's ledger. At the gallery's threshold, Lady Beatrice drew aside a velvet curtain. Inside, the long, rectangular room bore a dozen paintings, each spotlighted by brass lamps. The walls were a polished walnut, and the air smelled faintly of linseed oil and age. The empty spot where the miniature had hung was ringed by a faint halo of dust undisturbed on the glass. Poirot crouched, examining the dust. He produced a tiny torch from his waistcoat pocket and shone the light at different angles. There, just beyond the clear circle, was a minuscule shard of glass, almost invisible, and a single thread of violet silk caught upon a tiny splinter from the frame. Poirot retrieved both with delicate care, placing them in small glassine envelopes. "Remarkable," he murmured, rising. "These clues are most significant, though their meaning is not yet clear. Captain Hastings, I believe we shall reside here for the time being." He glanced at Lady Beatrice. "Be assured, madam, I shall unravel this mystery. Every secret in this house shall come to light." Lady Beatrice allowed herself a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. I have every confidence your little grey cells will succeed where mine have failed." Poirot returned her smile with gentle modesty. "Let us begin at dawn. Tonight, I shall reflect upon these fragments." He tucked the glassine envelopes into his case. Outside, the peacocks crooned softly, as though anticipating the drama to come. Inside, Poirot's mind danced with possibilities, each as colorful and intricate as the feathers of those silent statues. And so, under the watchful eyes of Peacock Manor, the great detective embarked upon his latest investigation, one that would test every nuance of his renowned methodical approach, his meticulous attention to detail, and his unparalleled psychological insight. The stage was set, the players assembled, and the game had begun. Chapter 2, Arrival and First Impressions. The next morning broke crisp and clear over Peacock Manor. A thin veil of mist curled through hedgerows and clung to the manicured lawns, lending the estate an ethereal hush. Poirot, ever punctual, rose before sunrise. He stood at the window of his guest suite, an elegantly furnished room overlooking the rose garden, adjusting the lace curtain to frame the view. Even in repose, the manor exuded an air of meticulous order, every rose bush trimmed to perfection, every blade of grass uniform in length. Poirot made a mental note of the dew patterns on each petal before turning to prepare for the day. At precisely 8 o'clock, he and Captain Hastings descended the broad oak staircase. The polished banister reflected their images as though they were part of the fine woodwork itself. In the gently lit corridor, they encountered Mrs. Harding, the housekeeper, whose severe black gown and crisp white collar seemed almost part of the manor's fixed decor. She greeted them with a curt nod. "Good morning, Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings. Breakfast awaits you in the dining room." Her tone was courteous but reserved, as though she were both welcoming and evaluating them. "Thank you, Mrs. Harding," replied Poirot with his characteristic politeness. "Your establishment is quite charming." Mrs. Harding inclined her head, careful not to display emotion. "I shall inform the household when you have finished." As they entered the dining room, the table was already laid, fine china, gleaming silver cutlery, and a selection of freshly baked breads and jams. Through the high windows, the peacocks strutted on the lawn, their plumage aflame with sapphire and emerald. Poirot seated himself with deliberate grace, while Hastings poured tea with jovial abandon. Across the table sat 3 other residents of Peacock Manor. First, Edward Astier, Lady Beatrice's nephew, leaned forward, studying his toast with knitted brows. He was a tall young man, elegantly dressed in morning coat and cravat, but his restless energy belied a troubled mind. Next to him sat Martine Duval, a French sculptor commissioned by Lady Beatrice to create a trophy for her upcoming charity gala. Martine's attire was unconventional, a loose linen blouse speckled with clay, and trousers tucked into well-worn boots. Her expressive eyes darted about the room, betraying a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Finally, seated nearer the windows was Mr. Blake, the Aesir's long-serving chauffeur, whose tweed cap sat askew on the back of his chair. He greeted Poirot with a broad, amiable smile. As Hastings poured second helpings of marmalade, Poirot observed each guest with the keen precision for which he was famed. Edward's knuckles were white as he lifted his teacup. Martine's hands, though deft with clay, trembled slightly. Mrs. Harding's posture remained rigid, as though girding herself for the day's trials, and Mr. Blake's calm demeanor seemed almost too steady, as though he were masking an inner turmoil. "Good morning to you all," Poirot said softly. "I trust your night was restful." His eyes paused on Edward. "You seemed not quite yourself at dinner." Edward flushed. "I confess I did not sleep well. One thinks of many things when the mind is troubled." "Indeed," Poirot murmured, nodding. He sipped his tea, noting its precise temperature and aroma. The weather predisposes one to reflection. Martine ventured a polite question. "Monsieur Poirot, may I ask, how do you wish to proceed today?" She clasped her hands, as though bracing herself. Poirot laid down his cup. "First, I should like to reacquaint myself with the layout of the manor. Then, if it pleases you, I shall inspect the gallery once more, this time alone." He inclined his head toward Mrs. Harding. "And perhaps, madam, you could show me the service areas. There are often secrets hidden in kitchens and pantries." Mrs. Harding's eyes flickered. "If Monsieur Poirot believes it necessary, I shall arrange it." She paused, then added in quieter tones, "But perhaps you would like to see the staff quarters as well. They are small, but orderly." "Très bien," said Poirot, pleased. Every room tells a story. After breakfast, the group dispersed to their respective duties. Hastings accompanied Martine to the studio wing, leaving Poirot and Mrs. Harding to explore the more utilitarian parts of the house. As they passed through a narrow corridor behind the kitchens, Poirot noted the spiced aroma of cinnamon and nutmeg from a basket of well-used baking tins. A large copper kettle sat on a hob, its spout blackened by soot. Nearby, a pile of neatly folded linen bore an imprint of a scissors cut in one corner, an indication, Poirot considered, of recent mending. Mrs. Harding led him into a small scullery. A single window looked out over the servants' courtyard. On the wooden floor lay a scrap of fabric bearing a purple hue, its weave coarse, likely torn from a working apron, Poirot deduced. He tucked it swiftly into his coat pocket. "Interesting," he said softly. "A fragment that might one day speak of urgency or struggle." He glanced at Mrs. Harding, her tightness around the shoulders betraying unease. "Has this fabric been here long?" She hesitated. "It was found this morning. I sent for Madame's nephew to inquire, but he claimed ignorance." Poirot nodded, filing the detail away. "Merci, Madame." He bowed slightly and stepped back into the corridor, where the shadows danced in the morning light. Rejoining Hastings and Martine in the studio wing, Poirot observed the sculptor's workspace. Marble dust-coated every surface, and half-finished busts leaned against the walls. One small statuette caught his eye, a likeness of a peacock mid-stride. Its tail feathers, carved in exquisite detail, seemed almost alive. Martine caught him studying it. "You admire my peacock," she said, touching the sculpture's beak with a delicate finger. "My gift to Lady Beatrice for her birthday." "A masterful piece," Poirot replied. "And yet, your gloves bear the same dust that coats this floor." He held out a hand. "Might I examine them?" Martine's expression flickered. She removed her right glove, revealing slender fingers smudged with marble residue. "I must needs handle the clay first," she explained. But I do not venture beyond the studio." Hastings laughed. "There you are, English logic meets French artistry." He slapped Martine gently on the shoulder. "A fair excuse, I say. No need to be frightened of tapioca pudding or Cornish pasties, eh?" Martine tried to smile, but Poirot's gaze was unwavering. He placed the glove on a nearby table and made a precise notation in his small notebook. "Very well," he said, "but I shall reserve my judgment." They moved on to Edward's domain, the library. Dark oak shelves groaned beneath the weight of leather-bound tomes. A heavy scent of old paper pervaded the room. Edward stood by a window, flipping absently through a book on Devonshire history. "There is much to learn in these volumes," Edward said, though his attention seemed elsewhere. "But I confess I have been distracted." "By what, mon ami?" asked Hastings, seating himself in a wing-back chair. Edward closed the book. "By my late father's affairs." The arrangements of his estate were complicated. Poirot approached a polished desk. He ran his finger along its surface, noting a faint smudge of ink near the blotter. "There is recent correspondence here," he observed. "Perhaps letters concerning your inheritance." Edward swallowed. "Yes. My solicitor visits later today. I fear matters have taken an unexpected turn." Poirot's small moustache twitched. "Indeed? We shall meet him shortly, then." Mr. Blake, summoned by Mrs. Harding's discreet knock, appeared in the doorway. "Begging your pardon, sirs, mademoiselle, I am needed to tend to Lady Beatrice's motor car. It seemed to show a fault this morning." Poirot studied the chauffeur. Blake's cap was dusted with dew, his overcoat buttoned to the neck. "A mechanical problem?" Poirot inquired. "Just a possible leak," Blake replied. "Nothing serious, but I thought it better to inspect before Lady Beatrice's drive this afternoon." "Very prudent," said Poirot. He gave Blake a kindly nod. "Your attention to detail is admirable." Meeting once more in the entrance hall, the party paused as Lady Beatrice descended the grand staircase. She wore a morning wrap of pale blue silk, her eyes bright and determined. She greeted each of them in turn, then approached Poirot. "Monsieur, I trust you are making observations?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. Poirot bowed. "Madam, the portrait's disappearance has revealed many small mysteries, like threads of a tapestry waiting to be woven together." Lady Beatrice smiled, though a shadow crossed her features. "I shall leave you to your work. I have a luncheon engagement." With that, she swept through the French doors leading to the garden. The group watched her depart, then exchanged silent glances. "Well," Hastings said at last, "the players are in position. How are you feeling, mon ami?" Poirot closed his notebook. "My little grey cells are active. I sense each individual here harbors a secret, some hidden by fear, some by guilt, and some, perhaps, by loyalty." He tapped his temple lightly. "Soon, all shall be revealed." Martine shivered, Edward straightened his cravat, Mrs. Harding's lips tightened, and Mr. Blake quietly slipped away. Only Poirot remained perfectly composed, a small smile playing beneath his waxed moustache. Thus ended the morning of arrival and first impressions at Peacock Manor, each detail observed, each suspicion noted, and each motive silently weighed. The stage was set for the investigation to deepen, as Poirot prepared to probe the minds and hearts of all who dwelt within those elegant walls. Chapter 3: The Vanished Miniature. Late morning sunlight filtered through the tall mullioned windows of Peacock Manor's gallery, casting long, angular shadows across the polished wooden floor. The air felt hushed, as though the very walls awaited Monsieur Poirot's next move. Having taken careful note of the stray fibers and glass shard from the previous evening, he now resolved to reconstruct the scene of the crime in full. Lady Beatrice Astir, composed yet anxious, led the way. Her lilac silk gloves were folded neatly in her gloved hand, as though to assure herself they bore no stain of guilt. "Here," she said softly, drawing back the velvet curtain, "is where the portrait hung." Poirot nodded, approaching the empty space. He closed his eyes for a moment, summoning a mental image of the tiny Joshua Reynolds miniature that once occupied the gilt frame. In his mind's eye he beheld its ivory background, the sitter's delicate attire, the glint of a pearl earring. He opened his eyes. For him, absence spoke as eloquently as presence. He crouched to inspect the carpet. "Observe, Captain Hastings," he murmured, "this slight depression and the scuff just here." He pointed to a pale mark, barely more than a whisper against the burgundy pile. "A foot, perhaps, hastily lifted. Note that the scuff extends forward but not behind. Whoever stood here did so briefly, then moved on." Hastings leaned in. "I see it, Poirot. But might not a servant simply have brushed against it when dusting?" "Possible," Poirot conceded, "but the precision of the mark suggests otherwise. Let us examine other details." He rose and approached the frame's empty niche. There remained a thin arc of tarnish around its interior edge, as though a glass cover had been in place, and a speck of dried blood, no larger than a pinhead, glistened faintly upon the gilt. Poirot plucked at his moustache, his brow knitting. "Remarkable," he said. "Blood of human origin, I judge, and fresh. The portrait itself may have been handled too roughly." He produced a magnifying glass and examined the gilt molding. Here, a scrape across the metal, and this tiny nail head, misshapen at one side. Poirot tapped it with his fingernail. It rang like iron. An implement of forced entry, perhaps, or simply the tool used to remove the frame from the wall. Lady Beatrice pressed her lips together. But no window was opened, and no alarm was triggered. "I cannot imagine how the thief gained access to this most private gallery." "Precisely why the matter interests me," Poirot replied. He rose and gestured to the room beyond. "Madam, with your permission, I shall walk through." Captain Hastings, observe the carpet along the corridor. "Mrs. Harding, might you join us here presently?" Mrs. Harding appeared promptly, her small black bonnet perfectly set. Poirot greeted her with measured courtesy. "Madam, have any of the staff spent extended time in this corridor overnight?" Mrs. Harding's pale face remained impassive. "Only the night nurse attended here when Lady Beatrice was ill last week. Since then, none have needed admission." "Thank you." Poirot turned to Hastings. "Notice how the carpet here is darker at the edges? The central strip appears less trodden." He bent to brush aside a fallen magnolia petal. "See here, a solitary lily pollen grain, not indigenous to the gallery's vase of roses. That suggests someone entered freshly from the gardens." Hastings whistled softly. "Outside in the dew, then in here. That narrows our suspect list." Poirot pocketed the grain in a small glassine envelope. "Let us question those present at the time of the disappearance." He led the group to the drawing room, where cushions lay neatly on sofas and afternoon tea remained untouched on a low table. Calling each person in turn, Poirot conducted brief, private interviews, beginning with Edward Astier. The young man met Poirot's gaze with an air of wounded dignity. "Edward," Poirot said kindly, "where were you between 10 and 11 last night?" Edward hesitated, sliding a lock of hair back from his temple. "I was in my study, drafting letters. I did not leave the room." His glance flicked toward Hastings, as if seeking corroboration. Poirot nodded. "May I see your study?" "I suppose so." Edward led them along the oak-paneled corridor to a smaller room lined with maps and writing implements. The desk held a single sheet, half filled with neat handwriting. Poirot noted the inkwell's lid askew, a blot of dark ink on the blotter, and a fine smudge of violet fiber on the desk corner, one that matched the fragment found in the scullery. He pocketed the fibre. "Thank you, Monsieur Astier," said Poirot, slipping the fibre into his coat. "You may return to the drawing room." Edward's posture sagged once the door closed behind him. Next was Martine Duval, the sculptor. In her studio, windows open to catch the morning breeze, she stood beside her peacock statuette. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began, "how long did you remain here last night?" Martine frowned. "I worked until very late on my commission and slept in my room above the gallery. I did not hear anything unusual." Her boots bore traces of marble dust, but Poirot had already established from Mrs. Harding that the sculptor often tracked this dust beyond her workspace. Poirot's gaze rested on the peacock sculpture. "A lovely piece. Tell me, mademoiselle, might you have removed a small portrait around the time of your work?" Martine's eyes widened. "Heavens, no. I have no interest in portraits. My work is sculptural." She glanced down at her hands. "Yet, I did notice the gallery was unlocked when I fetched fresh water this morning." "Unlocked?" Poirot's moustache twitched. "And you touched nothing else?" Martine swallowed. I brought a jug and saw the empty frame. I panicked and left immediately." Finally, Poirot requested Mr. Blake, the chauffeur, to join him in the courtyard. Beneath the early sun, Mr. Blake busied himself polishing the Aston Martin. "Monsieur Blake," Poirot said pleasantly, "might you tell me where you were last night between 10 and 11? Blake paused, cloth in hand. "I was cleaning the motorcar, monsieur. It needed an oil change, and I wished to finish before dawn." Poirot examined the car's undercarriage. "I see no signs of fresh oil. Nor do I observe any smudge of violet fibre or glass shards on the chassis." He handed Blake a small mirror. The chauffeur used it to inspect beneath the engine. "Correct?" "Correct, monsieur." "Thank you." Blake removed his cloth and returned to the garage. Back in the drawing room, Poirot gathered the group once more. Lady Beatrice and Mrs. Harding hovered near the fireplace. Edward and Martine exchanged uneasy glances. Hastings stood beside the window. Poirot cleared his throat. "We have several curious facts. First, the scuff in front of the niche. Second, the pollen grain from the gardens. Third, the blood spot on the frame. Fourth, the violet fibre found in the scullery and on Edward's desk. And fifth, the dented nail head." He paused, allowing each to absorb the details. "Now," he continued, "consider motive and opportunity. Someone familiar with the gallery's layout, someone who could enter unobserved, someone who expected to leave without alarming the household. Who, of you, would fit such a description?" Edward bristled. "I would never break my aunt's trust." Martine's lip trembled. "Nor I." Mrs. Harding straightened. "I serve Lady Beatrice faithfully." Poirot held up a slender finger. "On the contrary, madam, you admitted the library corridor pollen did not belong to your duties, and you found the fibre this morning. You might have tracked it exercising in the garden at dawn." Mrs. Harding's face paled. "I went there to water the roses before breakfast, yes. But I saw nothing." "Hastings," Poirot said, "you observed the varying carpet wear. You saw that minimal passage through this gallery gave cover to a single individual." Hastings nodded. Poirot turned to Lady Beatrice. "Madam, is there any person with whom you have recently quarrelled? A friend, a patron, a family acquaintance?" Lady Beatrice pressed her lips. "Only my solicitor, Mr. Hawkins. He visited last evening." "At 10 o'clock?" Poirot asked. "Precisely." "And Mr. Hawkins?" Edward exclaimed. "He is a gentleman of integrity." Poirot inclined his head. "Perhaps. Yet integrity does not preclude error, or opportunity. He rose and retrieved the glassine envelopes from his jacket. One by one he produced the pollen, the fiber, and the minuscule glass shard. These will undergo analysis. We shall determine the species of flower for the pollen, the composition of the fiber, and the origin of the glass. Meanwhile, I shall inspect Mr. Hawkins's correspondence. Poirot's calm certainty filled the room. Each person felt, however faintly, his scrutiny upon them. The vanished portrait, once a simple theft, had become a labyrinth of motives and means. As the sunlight waned and the Manor's shadows lengthened, an uneasy anticipation settled. The investigation had begun in earnest, and already the threads of suspicion curled tightly around each inhabitant of Peacock Manor. By day's end, their secrets would no longer remain hidden, and the little grey cells would turn their elegant precision upon the truth. Chapter 4. The red herrings emerge. That evening, after dinner in the candlelit dining room, Poirot requested that all the household convene in the drawing room. A single chandelier cast a soft glow across the velvet drapes and polished parquet floor, while outside the wind rustled agitatedly through the yew hedges. Lady Beatrice, Edward, Martine, Mrs. Harding, and Mr. Blake assembled promptly, each radiating a mixture of curiosity and unease. Poirot rose from his armchair, folded his hands, and regarded them with serene confidence. Miss Amis, he began in his refined English, we have collected several fragments of evidence, but as you know, not all fragments point directly to the culprit. Some lead us astray, red herrings, if you will. Tonight, I propose to highlight a few such diversions, so that we may clear the undergrowth and observe the true path. He crossed to the window on the west wall and pulled aside the heavy velvet drape. Moonlight streamed in, illuminating the narrow sill. Here, he said, pointing to the stone beneath the window, I discovered two distinct footprints, each different in size. One belongs to a small boot or shoe, perhaps Miss Duval's, measuring no more than a British women's size 4. The other is far larger, nearing a size 10, inconsistent with either Mr. Blake's sturdy footgear or Captain Hastings's more moderate size. Edward frowned. Surely that proves nothing. Any visitor might have left footprints. Ah, but the sill is 10 feet above ground level, reached only by clambering up a garden wall, Poirot explained, stepping down from the low dais. Thus, the person who entered through that very window did so deliberately, at considerable risk. Yet the gallery window was locked when I first inspected it this morning. Mrs. Harding's lips tightened. I assure you, Monsieur Poirot, I did not disturb the gallery door last night. I was in my own quarters. Precisely, madam, Poirot replied. And yet I found your white gloves, stained with dirty water, discarded by the flower beds. He produced a pair of gloves wrapped in a clean handkerchief. They bear traces of garden soil and a faint fragrance of lavender, a scent unfamiliar to me among Lady Beatrice's chosen perfumeries. Could you explain this? Mrs. Harding swallowed. I watered the rose bushes before breakfast, and perhaps dropped them there. That is all. Poirot's moustache quivered. An explanation, yes, but let us not conflate explanation with absolution. These gloves could have been placed deliberately to deflect suspicion. He turned to Martine. Mademoiselle, you declared you fetched water for your jug at dawn and found the gallery door ajar. Yet your studio lies on the opposite wing of the house, and its only water source is the central courtyard fountain. Martine's eyes flickered. I took the service corridor to avoid meeting the other staff. An unusual route, Poirot observed, but one that would allow you to pass the flower beds where the gloves lay. And I have already noted marble dust on those gloves, dust that matches your clay residue. Martine exhaled sharply. I told you, I work with clay. I do not steal portraits. Of course not, Poirot said kindly, but clay on gloves discarded in the garden suggests you left that room after your nocturnal errand. He paused, surveying the room. "We have also the nail head from the frame, bent and scraped. It may well have served to prise open the back of the frame. Yet none saw anyone in the gallery that night." Edward cleared his throat. "Perhaps the culprit hid within the gallery until midnight, then escaped through the window." "It is one possibility," Poirot conceded, "but then we must explain how the pollen grain from the rose garden was found in the gallery, moved by wind or carried on a shoe. Equally, the shard of glass I found upon the lobby mat suggests someone carried the glass cover elsewhere, most likely into the scullery, where I discovered a similar splinter near the wash basins." He offered Hastings a small envelope containing the shard. Hastings examined it. "I see. So the gallery glass and the scullery glass came from the same source." "Exactly, my friend. But why move broken glass into a scullery?" Poirot asked the group. "To hide it among other fragments, perhaps, or to mislead an investigator into thinking our culprit was a kitchen servant." Mrs. Harding's eyes narrowed. "I would never do such a thing." Yet Poirot nodded gravely. "Nonetheless, the scullery is itself a red herring. Our culprit may have deliberately placed the fragment there to cast suspicion upon the staff." A tense silence followed. Lady Beatrice, ever gracious, cleared her throat. "Monsieur Poirot, what then do you suggest?" "In due time," he said, rubbing his hands together. "First, consider the motives at play. A valuable portrait vanished, a will fragment hidden within it, suspicion cast upon house and family. What if the theft serves a deeper purpose than mere profit?" Edward stiffened. "You insinuate it was planned, not a crime of opportunity." Poirot tapped his temple. "Mon cher, I never insinuate, I deduce. A premeditated act leaves traces, the bent nail, the strategic footprints, the deliberate misplacement of gloves and glass. Yet the true criminal cannot afford to be careless. Thus, we must sift through these decoys to reveal a single, coherent thread." He crossed back to the armchair and sank into it, motioning the others to sit. "For this reason, I propose we examine anew the recent events at Peacock Manor, the widow's solicitor's visit, the disputes over the will, the charity gala preparations, and any clandestine meetings that may have occurred." Hastings looked at Martine and Edward in turn. "Perhaps each of you has witnessed something you thought unimportant at the time." Martine shifted uneasily. Edward bit his lip. Mrs. Harding's knuckles whitened on the arm of her chair. Blake, who had hovered silently near the door, cleared his throat. Poirot raised a delicate finger. "And tomorrow, we shall begin by retracing each step taken within these walls. We shall interview the night nurse, inspect Lady Beatrice's private rooms, and revisit the solicitor's correspondence. Only then will we disentangle these red herrings from the real motive and method." As the wind howled through the manor's eaves, each person pondered Poirot's words, and the possibility that their own carefully concealed truths might soon emerge into the moonlit gallery of justice. The threads of suspicion lay tangled, but Poirot's little grey cells were poised to unravel them one by one. Chapter 5, Tensions and Psyches. The following evening, Peacock Manor's dining room bustled with a subdued energy. The long mahogany table glittered beneath the candelabra's soft light, set with porcelain plates, crystal glasses, and silver cutlery polished to mirror shine. Outside, the peacocks had long since retired to their stately roosts, but within the house, human passions stirred with almost equal intensity. Lady Beatrice presided at the head of the table in poise and lavender silk, though her eyes betrayed a faint weariness. On her right sat Edward Asdear, tension writ large in the rigid set of his shoulders. Across from him, Martine Duval tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, and Mrs. Harding kept a vigilant eye on each serving of soup as if it might conceal some malicious ingredient. Mr. Blake stood ready to attend any request, while Captain Hastings, invited as honored guest, did his best to bring light laughter to the table. Poirot, seated between Lady Beatrice and Martine, allowed the conversation to flow as he observed each guest's mannerisms, ready to plumb the depths of their motives. As the first course was served, cream of mushroom soup accompanied by warm crusty bread, Poirot tapped his fork lightly on the plate to draw attention. "Madam," he began in his gentle, precise English, "you hinted earlier that our family solicitor, Mr. Hawkins, had business of some urgency with you this week. Might you tell us the nature of his visit?" Lady Beatrice paused, then lifted her spoon with calm restraint. "He wished to discuss revisions to my late husband's will. You understand, Monsieur Poirot, that Sir Lionel's affairs were extensive, properties in Cornwall, investments in London, and the marriage settlements for both myself and Edward." She set down her spoon. "I found certain clauses ambiguous, and I wished clarification." Poirot nodded, turning his gaze to Edward. "And you, Monsieur Astier, were you consulted in these revisions?" Edward's lip quivered. He reached for his glass of water and exhaled. "He informed me only that there might be changes to the inheritance schedule. I confess, I felt uneasy." His hand shook ever so slightly, betraying more than his measured tone. "A reasonable reaction," Poirot agreed. "Financial changes can evoke powerful emotions." He glanced at Martine. "You, mademoiselle, came here under commission for Lady Beatrice's gala sculpture. Yet I note your work remains incomplete, and your letter of agreement specifies payment upon delivery." Martine's cheeks bloomed pink. "Yes. I have been laboring to perfect the form. But Lady Beatrice kindly extended my deadline by a fortnight." Her gaze shifted to Edward, as though she feared he might reproach her. Poirot's eyes lingered on her. Deadlines tempered by generosity may also mask uncertainty. One works best when the mind is at ease. He turned to Mrs. Harding. "Madam, you have served this family for many years. How do you perceive these recent disturbances?" Mrs. Harding drew in a controlled breath before replying. "I have seen Lady Beatrice through poorer health and darker days. I serve out of loyalty, yet I worry for the household's reputation." She paused, then added quietly, "Rumours travel fast in Devonshire villages." Mr. Blake leaned forward, polishing a spot on the glass with his napkin. "A scandal would hurt more than the loss of portrait or will, it could ruin Lady Beatrice's standing." He looked to Poirot. "Perhaps that's why someone wishes to conceal the truth rather than expose it." Poirot tapped his chin thoughtfully. "Indeed, monsieur. Secrets can become burdens heavier than gold." He allowed the moment to settle before posing another question. "Edward, you've known your aunt all your life. How did your relationship fare after Sir Lionel's passing?" Edward's throat tightened. "We were close, at first. But after my father's funeral, I felt excluded. The manor felt too large, too silent. Lady Beatrice buried herself in her philanthropy, while I was left with a house full of reminders." His voice broke for an instant, then he steeled himself. "I understand her duties, yet sometimes I longed for family warmth, not cold charity." Poirot inclined his head. "Grief wears many masks. And Martine, your art often reflects inner turmoil. Does your recent work bear traces of personal struggle?" Martine glanced down at her hands, flecked with marble dust. "I lost my father 3 years ago. Sculpture was my salvation, but also my burden. Each piece must honor his memory." Her voice trembled, and she brushed away a tear before raising her gaze. "I do not steal to fund my art. I would rather work till dawn than compromise my integrity." Poirot's moustache twitched sympathetically. "A noble resolve. Yet desperation can compel even the upright to rash choices." He directed his next observation at Mrs. Harding. "Madam, you have remained loyal. but loyalty sometimes blinds us to the faults of those we serve. Have you witnessed disagreements between Lady Beatrice and anyone here? Mrs. Harding clasped her hands. Nothing overt, only whispered tensions. Edward grew distant, and Martine spent long hours alone in her studio. Mr. Blake keeps to his routine, though he seemed unsettled the morning of the theft. Poirot's small grey cells whirred as he absorbed each detail. He sipped his wine, just a mouthful, enough to appreciate its bouquet. And you, Mr. Blake, what weighs on your mind? Blake folded his hands on the table. I have served the Askews since I was a stable boy. This estate is my home. I would protect it with my life. Yet I sense fractures now, suspicion running through the household like poison. Poirot nodded gravely. Suspicion is indeed poison. It seeps into every corner, staining the purest intentions. He leaned forward, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I have observed each of you closely. Edward's grief, Martine's desperation, Mrs. Harding's loyalty, and Mr. Blake's protectiveness, all potent motives if pressed to extremes. But I seek not just motive, but means and opportunity. He sat back, folding his napkin. Before dessert, one more question: did anyone hear voices or footsteps near the gallery last night? Silence fell. Lady Beatrice turned to Mrs. Harding. You did the rounds, did you not? Mrs. Harding hesitated. Yes, but I heard nothing except the wind. And the peacocks, oddly restless even at that hour. Edward rubbed his chin. I heard a soft creak, as though a door moved, but I thought it was the old house settling. Martine's brow furrowed. I heard a whisper, words I could not make out, when I passed the corridor. Blake shook his head. All I heard was the engine starting in the garage, early, yes, but routine. Hastings cleared his throat in encouragement. A whisper, you say, Martine? Might you recall its tone or language? Martine closed her eyes. It sounded English, hushed. A voice of authority. Perhaps our solicitor. Poirot's eyes gleamed. An excellent observation, mademoiselle. Mr. Hawkins' voice would be deep, measured, and resolute. He tapped his fingers together. I believe we must speak with him directly. Lady Beatrice inclined her head. He arrives on Friday for further discussion. You shall meet him then. Poirot placed his dessert fork beside his plate, having tasted only a morsel. Very well. But until then, I shall reflect on this tapestry of emotions and half-heard sounds. He rose, signaling the end of supper. Thank you all for your candor. In time, the mind reveals what the mouth conceals. As the guests dispersed, some to the library, others to the conservatory, Poirot lingered for a moment, gazing at the empty plate before him. He whispered to himself, the psychology of crime is as labyrinthine as any lock. One must navigate each corridor of the heart to find the secret chamber. Outside, the wind sighed among the yews, and, somewhere in the darkness, a single peacock cried out, a mournful note that seemed to echo the unsettled spirits within Peacock Manor. Poirot, his little grey cells aflame with new insights, prepared to delve deeper into the tangled psyche of each suspect. The true motive lay buried beneath the layers of grief, loyalty, and desperation, and he alone possessed the key to unlock it. Chapter 6, A Second Shock. The morning sun rose pale and jagged over Peacock Manor, illuminating the dew-laden gardens in a fragile glow. Within the grand hall, however, an altogether darker discovery awaited the household. At precisely 8 o'clock, Mrs. Harding's urgent summons echoed through the corridors. All were to gather in the library without delay. Poirot and Hastings arrived to find Lady Beatrice standing by the towering bookcase, her calm demeanor fractured by distress. On the mahogany writing desk lay the family Bible, its once pristine pages dog-eared, its gilt edges dulled by careless handling. A sizable tear rent the centerfold, and a single loose fragment of parchment lay upon the open page, unrecognizable without context. My solicitors wrote that a portion of Sir Lionel's will was hidden within these bindings, Lady Beatrice said, voice tight. If that fragment is gone, the entire testament could be invalid. Edward, standing just behind his aunt, lurched forward. You mean the clause granting me my inheritance? Without it, the default provisions favor some distant cousins. He ran his hand through his hair in agitation. I shall receive nothing. Martine placed a steadying hand on Edward's arm, but her own lips were pale with shock. Mr. Blake cleared his throat, exchanging a troubled glance with Hastings. And Mrs. Harding, hands clasped before her, looked as though she might swoon. Poirot surveyed the torn Bible with professional detachment. Madam, if I may inspect this fragment. He lifted the loose leaf gingerly. On it, in sombre black ink, was a clause beginning, I bequeath unto my nephew Edward Askew, before the text was severed. The rest of the sentence had vanished. There is no note, no sign of forced entry here, Mrs. Harding said. I found the Bible like this when I came to open the shutters. Remarkable, Poirot murmured. He turned to Hastings. Have you observed any footprints or fibers near this desk? Hastings bent to examine the Persian rug beneath. Only the usual impressions, nothing fresh. He glanced upward to a high window. That window is latched. Unless someone climbed in and out through the conservatory. Poirot paced slowly. Conservatory, yes, where the shattered glass shard was found earlier. But no disturbance was reported there last night. He paused before Edward. Monsieur Askew, did you or anyone else handle the Bible after supper? Edward shook his head. I came to fetch a reference for my correspondence, but I did not touch it. I left it here intact. Mrs. Harding? My duty is to dust and polish, she said softly. I would never tear a family heirloom. Martine swallowed. I passed this desk in the dark on my way to the gallery, but I saw nothing amiss. And you, Mr. Blake? Asked Poirot. I serviced the cars at that hour, Blake replied. I would not enter the library. Lady Beatrice's voice trembled. So the fragment is truly gone. She clutched the Bible to her breast. Without it, Edward's future is in jeopardy. A heavy silence fell. Each person contemplated the torn page, its absence a more grievous blow than the stolen miniature. The lost portrait, though valuable, could be replaced, or at least its loss concealed. But the will fragment threatened hearts and fortunes alike. Poirot's moustache twitched in thought. There are two crimes now, the theft of the portrait and the mutilation of the will. They may be connected, or they may be the work of separate hands. Yet I suspect a single mind orchestrates both. Hastings frowned. But who would benefit most from Edward's disinheritance? A ripple of unease passed around the circle. Martine's fingers curled white around her teacup, though she had not yet touched it. Mrs. Harding's gaze darted to the portrait niche as though expecting to see it empty once more. Mr. Blake looked down at his polished shoes. And Lady Beatrice's eyes glistened with unshed tears, for Edward, for herself, for the collapse of all she held dear. Poirot approached the desk and drew a line around the tear with his fingertip. Notice how the edges are jagged, torn hastily, not cut with a blade. Someone in a hurry, someone who feared discovery. He placed a small glassine envelope over the torn page to preserve the evidence. And yet, to tear out a single leaf of such value requires both opportunity and knowledge of its location. He gazed each suspect in turn. Who among you knew of this particular hiding place? Edward spoke first, his voice thick. No one, aside from my aunt and myself. Martine raised her head. I was unaware of any will hidden here. I came only to sculpt. Mrs. Harding's lips quivered. I dusted these shelves weekly, but Lady Beatrice never asked me to remove or inspect this Bible. Mr. Blake swallowed. I have delivered letters here, but never touched the books. Poirot's small grey cells whirred. Then the culprit must have watched carefully, learned the arrangement of these volumes, and struck when the household's attention was diverted. He closed his eyes a moment, picturing the flow of activity at Peacock Manor the night before, the late-hour studio work, Edward's solitary vigil in his study, Mrs. Harding's rounds, Mr. Blake's early shift in the garage. Each alibi held a gap of several minutes unaccounted for. Lady Beatrice sobbed softly, and Hastings moved to offer comfort. Poirot, however, remained immersed in thought. He knelt by the desk. "Look here," he said, indicating a faint smudge of violet dye near the tear. "Similar to the fibre we found in the scullery and on Edward's desk." Edward straightened with alarm. "But I—" Poirot raised a hand. "I do not accuse yet, but I observe consistency in these clues. Violet fibre appears repeatedly in scenes of each crime. The garden pollen too, and the bent nail head. All speak of one person, or at least one plan." Martin spoke up, voice tremulous. "I admit I sowed violet petals in the rockery yesterday. Lady Beatrice asked for fresh cuttings for the gallery. Perhaps some stained the pages when I fetched a vase." "An explanation," Poirot said, "but not an exoneration. This dye adheres strongly to cloth, far more than petal juices." He rose, smoothing his jacket. "Whatever the motive, our culprit wishes to strip Edward of his birthright, and to hide the theft of the portrait behind a deeper injustice." Hastings rubbed his chin. "Then both the portrait and the wool fragment are pieces of the same puzzle." "Just so," Poirot agreed. He turned to Mrs. Harding. "Madam, might you recall if any of the staff remained unusually late in the gallery last night?" She hesitated. "Only the night nurse, as before. But she cared for Lady Beatrice in her chambers, not here." Poirot inclined his head. "And the night nurse, where might we find her?" "Her quarters are above the east wing," Mrs. Harding replied. "She leaves today to attend to another patient." "Excellent." Poirot folded his arms. "We shall speak with her before nightfall. Then, we must retrace every movement within this house, from dawn till midnight, and mark the spots where each of these telltale traces, pollen, fibre, blood, nail, may be found." Lady Beatrice drew herself up with sudden resolve. "Monsieur Poirot, please, find my nephew's inheritance. I cannot bear to see him deprived." Poirot offered a reassuring smile. "Rest assured, madam, that what has been taken shall be restored. Justice is not denied by tears." He patted Lady Beatrice on the shoulder and turned to Edward. "You shall sit with me this afternoon while I examine these clues further. Hastings will join us in interviewing the night nurse." As they dispersed, a hush fell over the library. The torn Bible lay open, its missing clause echoing the broken trust within the manor's walls. Outside, the peacocks stirred at the garden gate, their calls a distant lament. Inside, Poirot's mind busied itself with patterns and possibilities, each fragment a step closer to the truth, each suspect a piece in a mosaic of intrigue. By day's end, he vowed, the second shock would yield its secret, and the web of deceit would begin to unravel under the precise logic of his little grey cells. Chapter 7, The Gathering Storm. The afternoon sky over Devonshire was slate grey and brooding as Hercule Poirot summoned the household once more to the library. A scent of damp earth lingered in the corridors from a brief rain shower, and the polished floorboards creaked underfoot, a reminder that even the grandest house is not immune to age. Inside, Lady Beatrice, Edward, Martin, Mrs. Harding, and the solicitor Mr. Hawkins waited in subdued tension. Captain Hastings, acting as Poirot's aide, stood by the fireplace, awaiting instructions. Poirot, immaculate in his tweed suit and bow tie, motioned them to sit. He placed before him the torn fragment of the wool and the tiny glassine envelopes containing violet fibre, rose pollen, and the minute nail head. "Miss Amis," he began, voice measured and calm, "we stand at the threshold of revelation. Tonight, we shall revisit each crucial moment and retrace the movements of every person present in this house." He first addressed the solicitor. "Monsieur Hawkins, you visited last evening to finalize Lady Beatrice's will revisions. Pray tell us the precise time of your arrival and departure." Mr. Hawkins, a corpulent man with pince-nez perched on his nose, adjusted his cravat. "I arrived at 9:30, stayed until just after 10. My carriage awaited outside the main entrance." "Very good." Poirot leaned forward. "During that time, did you enter the gallery or the library?" "Neither, I assure you. My business concerned the study only." "And yet," Poirot said, holding up the violet fibre, "this die indicates recent handling of the wool pages. You work with ink and parchment daily. Would you not, perchance, have violet gloves or dyes in your office?" Monsieur Hawkins's brow furrowed. "I work in black ink only. No violet whatsoever." Poirot extracted the nail head. "This fragment bent from the portrait's frame suggests presence in the gallery. Yet you deny entry." Hastings cleared his throat. "Might someone have followed you quietly, Monsieur Hawkins?" Hawkins spluttered. "Preposterous." Poirot inclined his head. "Perhaps. But we shall verify your carriage route and the coachman's testimony." He slipped the evidence aside. "Next, Lady Beatrice, you retired at 10:30. Who entered your suite thereafter?" Lady Beatrice raised her chin. "Only my night nurse, Miss Quince. She administers my medicine at 11. "Excellent." Poirot turned to Mrs. Harding. "Madam, you assured me the nurse leaves today. Where might we find her?" "In the East Wing quarters," Mrs. Harding replied. "She will pack now." "Let us proceed at once," Poirot said. Within minutes, he, Hastings, and Mrs. Harding were in the narrow corridor outside the nurse's room. The door stood slightly ajar. Poirot rapped gently. "Miss Quince?" "Monsieur Poirot wishes to speak." A soft voice called, "Enter." They stepped inside a small chamber sparsely furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small writing desk. Miss Lavinia Quince, slight and pale, sat stitching a handkerchief. At the sound of Poirot's voice, she looked up, her dark eyes wide, a hint of fear in them. "Miss Quince," Poirot began kindly, "you attended Lady Beatrice at 11 last night. Did you see anything unusual in the gallery or the corridors?" Miss Quince smoothed her starched uniform. "No, monsieur. I gave Madame her laudanum, returned her to sleep, then went back to my room. I heard nothing but distant thunder." Poirot's keen gaze swept the room. He nodded toward a small wardrobe. "Might we inspect your gloves and attire?" The nurse rose and opened the wardrobe, pulling out a pair of white cotton gloves and a plain dark shawl. Poirot examined the gloves by torchlight. Clean. No hint of violet or soil. He sniffed the shawl gently. And no faint scent of lavender or rose. Miss Quince smiled wanly. "I assure you, I handle no flowers here." Poirot made a note. "Continue your preparations for departure, mademoiselle. I thank you for your cooperation." Back in the library, Poirot addressed the assembled company. "The nurse's innocence is confirmed. She had neither motive nor trace evidence upon her. We made clear her of suspicion." He paused, letting the relief register before continuing. "Now we return to the gallery and the dinner hour times between 8 and 10. Each of you had reason to be near either the gallery or the library. He gestured to Edward. Monsieur Astier, you said you drafted letters until 9:30. Would you mind demonstrating your movements? Edward stood and walked the path Poirot indicated, from the library, down the corridor, past the entrance to his own study, then back. At the gallery door, he paused, then turned away. I never entered, he said. Poirot nodded. Yet the fibre on your desk suggests you passed by the gallery with those violet petals. Edward flushed. I brought flower clippings for my aunt's bouquet. I did not think to change gloves. Understandable, Poirot said gently. However, the same fibre is embedded in the pages of the Bible and on your desk. More than accident, I believe. Edward looked away, agitation rising in his eyes. Poirot turned to Martine. Mademoiselle Duval, you labored in your studio until late. Would you show me the route you took back to your quarters? Martine rose and followed Poirot down a narrow servants' corridor. She pointed to a side door leading to the gardens. I cut through here to avoid disturbing the household staff. Poirot ran his fingertip along the door frame. No trace of soil or glass. Martine bent to inspect the threshold. None. Yet you told me the gallery door stood open when you fetched water at dawn. Martine clasped her hands. Yes, but I used the back staircase at that hour. Poirot hummed. Curious. And what of the shattered glass shard? It was found in the scullery, not here. Martine's eyes widened. I cannot explain that. Returning to the library, Poirot surveyed the gathering storm of suspicion. Each of you had opportunity, though only Edward had intimate knowledge of the will's hiding place, and only Mr. Hawkins had motive to see Edward disinherited, since his fees might increase with prolonged uncertainty. He held up the tiny disk of rose pollen. This, too, appears in the studio, the garden, and the gallery. Someone moved deliberately through these spaces, carrying petals to misdirect our attention. Mr. Hawkins cleared his throat. Surely you do not implicate me. Poirot's eyes danced. Not yet. But the solution lies in the convergence of motive, disinheritance, method, forced removal of the will, and opportunity, knowledge of Lady Beatrice's routines. He tapped his temple lightly. Tomorrow at dawn I shall require access to Lady Beatrice's private portfolio and the original portrait case. There, I anticipate finding the final clue. A tense hush settled. Lady Beatrice glanced from one face to another, her expression weary yet trusting. You believe someone orchestrates these events from within? When will the truth emerge? Poirot smiled with gentle confidence. Very soon, madam. The violet thread that binds these misdeeds will be pulled taut. As the household dispersed under the gathering storm clouds, each carried a new weight of suspicion. In the hollow of the manor, shadows deepened, every footstep seemed fraught with peril. But Poirot, ever serene, retired to his papers, certain that the next day's light would illuminate the darkness that lay at the heart of Peacock Manor. Chapter 8. The Little Grey Cell's Triumph. The dawn mist still clung to the hedgerows when Hercule Poirot sent for every resident of Peacock Manor to gather in the gallery. The velvet curtains were drawn back, revealing the empty gilded niche where the miniature had once hung, and beside it, the massive family Bible with its torn centerfold. Each guest, Lady Beatrice, Edward, Martine, Mrs. Harding, and even the solicitor, Mr. Hawkins, looked upon Poirot with a mix of anxiety and expectation. Captain Hastings stood at his side, ready to assist. Poirot cleared his throat and surveyed the assembly with kindly but piercing eyes. Miss Amis, you have endured suspicion, fear, and confusion these past days. Tonight, the method and motive behind these crimes shall be laid bare. I entreat your patience as I recount the chain of events. He first addressed the torn will. Holding the open Bible, he indicated the jagged tear. On the morning of the theft, Lady Beatrice discovered this fragment missing. The culprit sought to disinherit her nephew by removing the clause granting Edward his rightful inheritance. Yet the method of the tear, hasty, uneven, betrays the hand of one unaccustomed to delicate work. He laid aside the Bible and produced a small gilt frame backing from his coat pocket. Meanwhile, the missing miniature portrait concealed within its mounting a second hiding place, one we did not inspect until today. He held up the backing. Hidden behind this panel was the very wool fragment, fastened by a slender ribbon. Thus, the theft of the portrait served a dual purpose, to conceal the removal of the clause while masking the motive behind the initial disappearance. A murmur spread through the group. He purple dye-stained you, not by design, but by circumstance. Edward let out a breath. Poirot's moustache twitched as he laid the backing on a side table. Now, let us consider opportunity and evidence. First, the footprints upon the windowsill, one pair small, one large. The small prints belong to a slender boot, roughly a British women's size 4, those of Mademoiselle Duval. The larger prints were a deliberate misdirection, placed with a pair of studio boots borrowed from the gallery to implicate another. Martine's face drained of color. Poirot continued, the bent nail head found on the floor was torn by the very implement you use in your studio to score marble, the same tool you wield occasionally outside your sculpting work. You prized open the frame with it, then discarded it among the shards of glass in the scullery to deflect attention onto the house staff. He held up a small glassine envelope. Next, the violet fiber. You told us of fresh cuttings of violet petals you collected for Lady Beatrice's gallery display. Yet no petal juice could stain as persistently as the dye from your sculptural cloths, worn while you shaped clay figures. That dye transferred to the gloves you discarded in the gardens, and onto the pages of the Bible when you hastily hid the wool fragment behind the portrait backing. Martine's lips trembled as she sunk into a chair. Monsieur Poirot, she whispered, I did not plan to harm Edward, I only sought funds for my commission. I meant only to conceal the portrait until I sold it discreetly. I did not anticipate finding the will. Poirot inclined his head compassionately. In your panic, mademoiselle, you saw the torn Bible as an insurance. If the clause were missing, all suspicion would focus upon an inside hand, and the portrait's fate would remain hidden. He turned to Edward. Monsieur Astier, you were never the culprit. Your visits to the gallery corridor and the fiber upon your desk resulted from your innocent attempt to bring fresh flowers to your aunt. T had not realized he was holding. Mrs. Harding and Mr. Hawkins exchanged relieved glances. Poirot addressed the solicitor next. Monsieur Hawkins, he said gently, your visits concern genuine revisions to the will. You bore no violet gloves, no clay dust, and no motive to see Edward disinherited. Your fees were fixed. Had you harbored such a motive, you would have had much simpler means than theft and deception. Hawkins straightened and nodded, gratitude evident in his eyes. Mrs. Harding, too, found her composure, for the scullery fragments were placed to deflect from the gallery's true scene. Poirot lifted the portrait backing once more. Finally, the portrait itself, now revealed, complete and undamaged, save for a smudge of clay at its corner, was concealed in your studio behind unfinished sculptures, mademoiselle. I retrieved it from beneath the cloth draped over your workbench. You meant to sell it, but the discovery of the wool fragment led you astray. He paused, letting the clarity of his deductions settle. Thus, the twin crimes, the theft of the portrait and the mutilation of the will, were perpetrated by a single mind, driven by desperation for funds and complicated by the unexpected find of the inheritance clause. Martine covered her face with her hands, tears slipping between her fingers. I am so sorry. I never wished to bring shame upon Lady Beatrice. I only... Lady Beatrice rose, moving to the young sculptor's side. Martine, you are forgiven. Your desperation spoke too loudly. Let us restore both the portrait and the wool claws, and find a compassionate solution for your commission." Poirot smiled, his little grey cells satisfied. He laid the wool fragment into Lady Beatrice's hand and handed the portrait to Mr. Hawkins to return to its frame. "Justice is served when intention and method are illuminated," he remarked. That afternoon, with the portrait rehung and the Bible restored, Edward embraced his aunt. Mrs. Harding fetched fresh lavender gloves for Martine, and Mr. Hawkins arranged for a private consultation to formalize the revised will. Captain Hastings, ever the chronicler, patted Poirot on the shoulder. "My dear friend," Hastings said, "once again you have revealed the hidden threads that bind crime and motive." Poirot bowed, moustache quivering with pleasure. "It is nothing without the cooperation of those of whom we require the truth. But remember, Hastings, it is our little grey cells that weave the tapestry of justice." As the sun broke through the clouds over Peacock Manor, harmony returned to its corridors. The peacocks strutted once more in the gardens, their plumage a vivid reminder that even the most intricate puzzles can be solved with patience, compassion, and the finest of detective minds. And so concluded another triumph of Hercule Poirot, whose elegant precision restored peace to all beneath the manor's roof.